today's session, right, is to probably give you about, I don't know, 35 minutes worth of content with a bunch of time at the end for questions. I'll say this again in a second in case people are joining late, but anytime that you do have a question, fire away, okay? Daniel and some of the guys monitoring those questions, they're going to get them across to me. Probably take like 2 or 3 natural pauses during the presentation. And when I do that, I'll take a quick drink and I'll look and see if I can answer any questions. On the topic of questions, right, that's a really good point. I don't know the answer to everything, that's for sure. I will also say so it's my personal policy that all questions are valid. So if you're on the call and you've got a question, maybe you don't understand something that I've explained, or maybe you don't understand something just in general, right? Do not be embarrassed to ask that question. No question is too easy, and no question, well, loads of questions actually are too hard, all right? But still ask them. We'll try and answer them, and we maybe even come back to them in a later blog post or something. But if you have a question, do not be embarrassed to ask it. Ask away. It's like our policy that the person who asks the most questions is the brightest person on the call and the bravest. Anyway, I reckon people are getting joined now. So this is me. Daniel's given me a bit of an introduction. Yes, I spend way too much time working with containers and Kubernetes, and have done for as long as I can remember now. Anyway, I might look miserable. I don't know. Certainly on that picture. But I'm super approachable and I'm super passionate about technology. So I love connecting with people and talking about technology. That's my Twitter handle. That's my website. By all means, let's connect. Yes, I've written a couple of books. I won't go too much because Daniel said it. I am a Docker captain. Most importantly, though, I have got loads of videos on Pluralsight about Docker and Kubernetes. Now, this is kind of a state of the union. If I wind it back, we are going to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. All right. With an example thrown in, I think. But I'm assuming that a lot of you are coming to this like with maybe you're not quite a Kubernetes expert yet. So on the screen are a few courses that I have on Pluralsight. They're all amazing, right? Loads of fun. You can read the reviews on them. This is not just me saying it, right? But starting at the top, like just if you are an absolute beginner and you've really never deployed a container before, maybe you've heard of containers and Docker and Kubernetes, but aren't really sure. And if somebody was to put you on the spot at the coffee machine at work, you'd be a bit uncomfortable answering. Docker and Kubernetes, the big picture, that course is for you. By the end of that, you'll be dead comfortable talking to people at the bar or the coffee machine, wherever. Next, getting started with Kubernetes gets you a lot more hands-on. By the end of that course, you'll have enough in your skill set to be able to take your own next steps. But then I've got more courses as well. Of course, you can just search Pluralsight for my name. In fact, actually, I should say, of course, you can search Pluralsight just for Kubernetes as well, because there's not just me creating courses out there. We've got loads of good courses. I can just vouch for my own, that's all. And all of my video courses, Docker, the lot, you can get via my own, well, you can see the list via my own website. Like I was saying about questions, please do ask questions. There's like, I know we won't have this many people on the live stream, but we've had over 2,000 people register for the call, I think. And it's kind of difficult to make a call with this many people on interactive. However, we want it to be as interactive for you as possible. So by all means, if I've not explained something very well, ask the question. And if it is, even if it's not something that I've been talking about, we'll probably leave it till the end and I'll do my best to answer it. So just a quick one to Daniel as well, while you're filtering through questions, if we can prioritize any question that seems to be about things that I've already talked about, that would be useful for me, because those are the best questions for me to answer as we go throughout the live stream. Anything that's on a topic that I haven't covered in particular, try and park those to the end. Sometimes easier said than done, so don't stress. Anyway, Kubernetes, there's loads of hype. Everybody on this call is probably, for at least part of the reason they're on the call, is due to the hype. I've said this in quite a few situations before. Whenever there's hype, you have people on both ends of the spectrum, right? At extremes, yeah? So on one extreme, you might have the people that think Kubernetes is the best thing in the world and is the answer to everybody's technology problem. Then at the other extreme, I've said this before as well, some people view it as software-defined evil, right? It's just not the right solution for anything. I sit somewhere in the middle, and I tend to feel that the truth of the matter is somewhere in the middle. But there's lots of hype. And sometimes I feel like in the industry that hype sometimes doesn't have substance behind it, but at other times the hype is because there is so much substance. I hope I explained that well. So I think in the case of Kubernetes, and certainly almost the wider container ecosystem as well, the hype exists because this technology is literally changing so much. However, I love this quote, right? The source of the quote is anybody's common sense, I would hope. As much as I love Kubernetes and do see it being the answer to many, many problems, it is not for everybody, okay? And anybody that says it is and tries to sell you it, that it's the be all and end all, it's not, okay? Like I said before, it's somewhere in the middle of being absolutely amazing and terrible. It's pretty darn good. So what I would suggest based on this slide, right, is just a couple of tips, right? If you are a small company with not a lot of applications and not necessarily a lot of engineering time or talent, I would suggest maybe Kubernetes is not for you. I would suggest that containers and cloud native microservices patterns are probably for you, because that allows us to build and deploy and manage applications in a very modern way. So a way that we can automatically react to events and scale and self-heal, rolling updates with no downtime, version rollbacks, all that kind of stuff. You should be adopting those patterns, right? But if you are small with a lack of engineering time and talent, maybe something like Docker Swarm or some of the native cloud-based container platforms might be a better solution for you. However, I think going forward, as Kubernetes gets easier and easier, and there are more packaged options, for want of a better term at the moment, then Kubernetes is going to be for more and more people. So it's a little bit, if you bear with me here, right, little bit like what Linux was like in the early days. Quite daunting if you were not a kernel engineer. So back in the early days of Linux, you would have to compile from source and make, and honestly, just installing Linux it took hours, and quite often, at least for me, right, even when it was up and running, wasn't like 100% certain how it all worked. So when something went wrong, I was straight back to the internet. Whereas now Linux is super easy, right? You can just download it and install it. You can just point and click and get Linux instances on your public cloud, and probably your private hybrid clouds as well. Kubernetes is not, so a couple of years ago, it was super, super hard to install Kubernetes. It's a lot easier now, and it's getting easier and easier and easier. So I think while it may not be for you right now, if you decide it's not, and this is your decision, right, because you know your environment and your organizational structure better than I do. If you decide it's not for you right now, please just keep an eye on it, because it may be right for you in 2 or 3 years' time. Anyway, which kind of brings me to my next point. If you snooze, you lose. I had a conversation recently, which, looking at my slides, I think we'll come to a little bit later if we have the time. But the organizations that were big organizations years ago that are not so big and successful now, and some of them are no longer in existence, quite often had a corporate mindset of not wanting to change or accept change. Maybe they had a strong position in the market with great products and thought that that would never change. And that kind of mentality filtered down through to the technology organization as well, which was put under pressure, of course, to cut costs, which is sometimes an important thing, let me say. But there was, it made it so that it wasn't possible to adopt new technologies. And these businesses didn't adopt new technologies and didn't adopt new products and grow new products and things like that. And they're less relevant now than they used to be. So just make sure that that's not you, right? Keep your eye on the ball. I'm assuming most of you are technologists, right? So you keep your eye on Kubernetes in the hope that your organization modifies and grows and tweaks its own products and gives you the power and or empowers you, I should say, to deploy the right technologies to grow and, you know, keep the business going and relevant. So what next? All right, let's get on to the good, the bad, and the ugly. Kubernetes, the good. This slide here, right? Of course, I've just made up these graphs, but what I'm saying is that in almost every way that you look at Kubernetes, it's heading in the right direction. So wind it back just a little bit and say, right, if you have decided, and I'm assuming that probably most of you either have decided or are in the process of deciding, this is why you're on this call, right, that Kubernetes either is for you or might be for you. If you've made that decision, then all 4 blocks on this chart right now show you that it's a good investment for you. Of course, like we had this in the early days of the, and we still have it in the cloud now, right? Although to a lesser extent, where there's so many options for different cloud platforms, right? And which one do you choose? And in the early days, it was kind of, there was always the risk that if you chose the wrong cloud platform, that 6 months or 12 months down the line, it might not even exist, and you've invested in it and now you have to get off it, and it's like quite challenging. Yeah, well, all of these charts that I've made up, right, show you that it looks like Kubernetes is here for the long run, and that if you bet on Kubernetes, that it's probably a pretty decent bet, assuming, of course, that we've said you've got an organization structure and an engineering team with the time and talent to take it on. So for instance, customers are deploying Kubernetes like crazy, but the vendors as well, right? I mean, Microsoft and Red Hat and IBM and people have been in for a long time. Google, of course, AWS. But even just this last week, HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, have had their annual Discover event as a virtual event. And there's lots of talk from them via their GreenLake product, managing and orchestrating containers. And Kubernetes is at the heart of all of those kinds of things, right? So customers and all the big vendors are buying in. There's a very strong ecosystem as well. So not just vanilla Kubernetes, but storage solutions, networking solutions, logging solutions, security solutions are all building up around Kubernetes and getting stronger all the time. Kubernetes came out of Google in 2014 and I think was open source to the CNCF, or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, as version 1 in 2015. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure those are the right dates. 5 years old, right? So although, yes, it is bleeding edge, it's not brand new. So some parts of it, yes, are green around the edge, if you will, right? But a lot of the core features of Kubernetes now are mature and stable, and then it's just got loads of momentum. I liken it all the time to being like VMware, right? If you never got on with VMware and virtual machines, you're probably out of business now. The same is potentially, in my view of the world, going to happen if you don't get on board with containers, microservices, Kubernetes, all of that jazz, right? So what's Kubernetes good at, right? It's really good at stateless applications. So nothing that has to persist data. Now, let me caveat that, right, with that. I'm not saying Kubernetes isn't good at stateful workloads like databases and persistent data stores, because it is, and it's getting better all the time. It's just really, really good at stateful things because it's done them for a long time. Those are the easy things. So stateless stuff on Kubernetes is simple, it's mature, and it's feature rich now. Of course, Kubernetes is good with containers. It does other stuff, like it can manage virtual machines and serverless workloads and things for you, but containers at the moment is its bread and butter. I'm just looking at the time here, just to make sure I don't run super over. No, I think we're all right at the moment. And it's amazing at its buzzwords, right? Cloud native microservices, right? Let me just, I've got video courses on Pluralsight, of course. Docker and Kubernetes, the big picture, and getting started with Kubernetes go into superb detail of what cloud native and microservices means, okay? Animations, the lot. So you'll come away and you'll be like, I totally get that now. For now, though, I want to just say, you know, for the longest time, of course, we have written our software applications to run on Windows or Linux. And the beauty of that is it doesn't matter if it's a Dell or an HP or a Cisco server below it. And now in the cloud world, it doesn't matter if it's an AWS instance below that operating system. We write our applications for Linux or Windows. We don't care about the infrastructure underneath, right? Well, Kubernetes is like that for the cloud, all right? So you can have AWS or Google Compute Platform or Azure platform or any of these different clouds out there. If you have Kubernetes installed on them, like you would install an OS on a server, then it doesn't matter which cloud you've got below. You write your applications to Kubernetes and you can care almost not at all about the infrastructure below it. So that's what kind of Kubernetes is good at. And I want to do a quick demo. But before I do that, I'm just going to check my Slack here and see if Daniel's given me any questions. So we've got a couple of questions here. I'm just going to take a drink of water while I read one, okay? The way I've got them here is, I'm sorry, I don't know who has submitted these questions, but whoever it is and everybody that submitted those questions, thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, so considering we don't pay for master nodes on AKS, at least at the moment, okay, what is your guidance on using namespaces versus separate clusters? A little bit off topic for now, but I can answer that one. So namespaces do not isolate workloads. They must not be considered a security boundary or a workload isolation boundary. So let's say I had, it's just an example, right? But I had a Kubernetes cluster and I was hosting services for 2 competing clients. I would not isolate those clients on the same cluster using namespaces. I would absolutely put each client on their own Kubernetes cluster. Any situation where you need to isolate workloads from a security perspective or from like not a policy, but from like a legal perspective or anything like that, put them on their own clusters. Namespaces are great for applying quotas and role-based access control, you know, or different policies for both of those on a single cluster. But if you've got to isolate workloads, put them on their own clusters for the time being. Of course, that may change. You know, there's always new technologies coming along. Next question. When should we use Kubernetes instead of Docker Swarm for container orchestration? So Docker Swarm and Kubernetes do similar things. Swarm is a much smaller, lightweight, simpler product to use. Kubernetes has a steeper learning curve, but does a lot more. I think Docker Swarm is maybe more of a fit if you are a small organization with less engineering talent. But if you want to make a strong bet on the future and you're going to invest in something that you see for the long term, I think Kubernetes is a great choice. I'm going to leave the other questions until the end at the moment, and I'm going to crack on with a quick demo here, okay? So I have got, this is a Kubernetes deployment manifest. It's just a way of deploying an application, okay? Don't be like, oh my goodness, that looks so complicated, because like I totally get that it can if you're new to this. It's basically saying, run me a container on Kubernetes on port, this is a container specification here, on port 8080, based on the software that is in this image here, Nigel Poulton /PS Web 1.0. Don't worry about the detail. My video courses go into all of that. We're saying, just run this container for me. In fact, we're saying, let's run 2 copies of this container. So right now I have got no pods, which basically means no applications running. So if I apply the configuration from that file to my, oh, I think I've made a typo in it. Oh, in fact, I've missed an entire line off. Got to love a bit of live troubleshooting like this, yeah? API version is apps, I hope it is, apps v1 and kind deployment. Let's hope that works. Otherwise, I'm like in panic mode. And nobody likes me being in panic mode, do they? I'm going to make sure I'm in the right directory as well. API, all right, so metadata.labels invalid. Okay, I will have one more go at this. I'm not sure that I see the issue here. Metadata.name. I'm going to do this. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. The wrong version of a file. Yeah, so let me work out where we are. So I'm in Kubernetes Pluralsight. So if I just open this, this is good stuff. and I'm new on a Mac. Kubernetes, Pluralsight. Oh, that's right, I am there. App.yaml, yes. Let me give it one more try. If this doesn't work, then I will hold my hands up in shame. Okay, let me have one look. Hello, wise is invalid. Spec template metadata labels, invalid value. Map string, app ps, select. Oh, yes, I know what that is. I know what it is. Good. We have got here. Now, don't worry. Let's just pretend that didn't happen. Right. So if I now go kubectl get pods, I love that, right? I've got 2 pods that are in the process of creating, right? They're just a simple web server. I'll throw a watch onto that. Sometimes it can take a few seconds for a pod or a container to come up because it's pulling the image from the internet to my local machine. That's running now, though. So I have got 2 pods running a web server. Now, if I want to say, actually, business requirements have changed and later on we're going to have a spike in demand, I just change that value from 2, I don't know, let's say to 10. I've saved that. If I then reapply the file with the new configuration and look at pods again, we will see, wow, so I'm getting a bunch more containers that are being deployed. Now, I'm showing you a really simple example here. Kubernetes has technologies built in that will monitor CPU load and things like that, and will be able to scale up and down automatically for you. My point here is, look, with just by changing a value in a configuration file from 5 to 10, now has me got 10 pods that are currently running. If I also go kubectl delete pod, let's say a pod crashes, we'll demonstrate self-healing here. I've got 10 pods here. This is a list of names. If I copy that name and I manually delete that particular pod, I've gone down to just 9 pods running now. So if I go kubectl get, and don't worry about these commands, right? I'm already back up to 10 pods out of 10 running. And if we look at the pods again, we will see that one of these pods has only been running for 16 seconds, right? Whereas all of the others are around about a minute. I hope you can see this, the text on the screen there, because that's vital to understand what's just happened there. So I manually deleted a pod. I could have deleted the node that it was running on. Doesn't matter. Kubernetes knows I should have 10 running because in the config file, I've told it this is what I want. I want 10. When I deleted one, maybe it crashed. It doesn't matter. I went down to 9 very briefly. But Kubernetes is always watching the cluster saying, I've got to have 10. I've got to have 10. I've got 10. Or no, now I've only got 9. I better spin another one up to get me back to 10. So we're now back to 10. But one of them, this is the new one that Kubernetes span up to replace the one that failed. So it's been running for less time. So that is an example of self-healing. Now, let me just see if I can apply this real quick to enhance the demo. I'm going to deploy a Kubernetes service, which is just a way for me to expose that application to the internet. If I go kubectl get service, this is the name of the service I just deployed, and it's got a public IP. If I copy that, it's oh, I don't have the internet running yet. Let's have a look. Chrome. Now I hope this works. Yeah. Okay. So we've got a website running there. This is the application that we've got running back here. Now, if I want to push a new version of that application, it's really as simple as coming in and saying, let's change it from version 1.0 to 2.0. Now, bear in mind, it says the current version says hello from Pluralsight. I change that to 2.0 in my file. And I say, push that new configuration, not that one. This one, push this to the cluster. And let's watch my pods, because we should see a bunch of pods terminating and a bunch of new pods coming up. What it's going through and it's starting up a new pod with the new version, turning off an old one with the old version. So if I come here and I start hitting refresh, I should hopefully, now I wonder if I even change that. At some point, I might come back to this later. we should get some different text in there when they are up and working. We can see the rolling update is still happening there. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Going to jump quickly back to the slides. What's Kubernetes not so good at? Well, if this was the momentum, like if this is kind of the trajectory that the project has, we said this was a good thing, yeah? It's accelerating fast. It's doing really well. It's a pretty decent bet if we're wanting to choose a technology for the next, this is my words, right? 5 years plus. However, I know that's like, that looks really amateurish when I look at it now, but I just wanted to say that so many parts of Kubernetes, and this is getting better. Don't get me wrong, that arrow was 100% vertical a couple of years ago. I want to get across the point that some parts of Kubernetes are still super, super complex. And you must be aware of that. And Kubernetes has to get better at that before it's, I don't know, I want to say before it's available to mere mortals. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way to anybody. But before Docker came along, for example, Google was running its internal infrastructure for Gmail and search and everything on containers for years, but you just had to be practically a rocket scientist to do it yourself. Docker came along and made containers simple for average people like me, okay? Kubernetes is almost simple enough for average people like me, but there's still work to be done there. Fortunately, of course, shameless plug for myself and for the Pluralsight platform, we've got some very, very good content out there to bootstrap you with Kubernetes, get you up and running and on your own 2 feet. Let me have a look at a couple of questions here. I'll see if we've got anything that's particularly relevant to what I've been talking about there. What is my opinion of Kubernetes and mainframe? So I am a firm believer that everything that we do in technology today has already been done on the mainframe 40 years ago. I will say that. So you can run like containers and Kubernetes on Linux, on IBM Z series or Z series, but that's not on System 390 or whatever the mainframe operating system is. I'm not really sure what else I should say to that question because I might be misinterpreting the question. Let's have a look. What are your top picks for free or paid tools to help with managing Kubernetes? I'm going to park that one because I'm coming to that. I've got a slide on that later. These days, with many Kubernetes offerings in the cloud, why should I consider to deploy Kubernetes on premises? Brilliant question. So hosted Kubernetes as a service from your cloud provider is like super good way to get Kubernetes with almost zero effort from you. And you get something that is production grade. I do that because production grade to me means something different to what production grade means to you. But your cloud provider will provide you at almost zero effort, but at a cost, financial cost, right? A highly available high performance Kubernetes. The only time you would want to run it on premises, well, would be if you're not allowed to run your workloads in the public cloud. But also it can be cheaper if you have the in-house skills because as good as cloud services are, I think anybody that has deployed at large scale on the cloud knows that costs can rapidly go through the roof. So I'll come back to more questions later, but let me crack on with the slides for a little bit now. I'm going to skip that demo. I just want to say, so on the topic of Kubernetes, I've kind of just answered that question. For very little effort on your behalf, you can get a quote unquote production grade Kubernetes, but it will cost you money. So be careful as always in the cloud. If you spin something up just to play around with and you forget to turn it off in a month's time or even later, you're going to have a bill for that. All right. Look, there's loads of different tools and things out there. I don't work for Rancher. As far as I'm aware, I've never been paid any money by Rancher or anything like that. I just genuinely like almost everything that the guys at Rancher do. They were in early with Docker. They've been at the forefront of so much development in Kubernetes. So I love what they're doing with K3S. If you already know a little bit about Kubernetes and you want a fun, cool project, go check out Kubernetes, K3S and Rancher as well. I want to just get my view back to here real quick though. Now, the other thing, a bit of Star Trek or something here. The other thing that I don't think Kubernetes is very good at, and I advocate for quite a lot to get better, is it is developing at warp speed. Now, look, that's important. You know, of course, I'm never going to say fast development of new features and things like that is not a good thing. It is. But just as an example, right, Kubernetes at the moment, and things are potentially slowing down slightly because of what's happened recently globally, okay? But for the longest time, we have had 4 big Kubernetes releases each year. And that's great, like, if it's a fun project and maybe, well, I shouldn't say it's fun for the maintainers because those guys work really, really hard. But for you to deploy something that's mission critical line of business production on a platform that's giving you 4 big releases a year, it sounds alarm bells to a lot of people, right? So there's nothing that's the equivalent of like a long-term stable release. And I'm a huge advocate of slowing down that release cycle and hopefully implementing something that looks like a long-term stable. So for me at the moment, the bad things about Kubernetes tend to come down to the complexity and how fast it's iterating, because I think those 2 things are prohibitive for a lot of people. And as a community, we just need to get better at that. And if you have the opportunity to get involved and help out with the community in any way whatsoever, please, let's do that, right? Get involved. We need more people. Kubernetes, the ugly. I was going to put a picture of me on the next slide here, right? But instead, you. And I don't mean any disrespect to anybody, right? I don't see anything about Kubernetes as a technology or as a project as massively ugly, right? I've held my hands up and been honest that it's not perfect. You know, it's too complex and it's iterating too fast, right? But the ugly thing, I think, will be if you ignore it and think that you don't have to deploy it. So coming back to something that I said earlier on in the presentation, right? I watched the keynote at HPE Discover virtual event earlier this week, right? And John Chambers, who before what he's doing now was long-time chief at Cisco. So now a guy with a lot of experience in the industry, saying that 40 to 50% of the Fortune 500, in his opinion, won't exist in 10 years. And then my buddy Nick Howell here saying, you know, he's got some stats and things that show that, you know, over the last 10 years, the S&P 500 here has just changed like crazy. Like we have $3 trillion tech companies on there now. And if you look at the difference between the companies from 2009 to 2018, at the top there, and I know that this isn't everybody, right? But I do think it's representative of even medium and small businesses, right? Quite often, and I'm not speaking to any of the companies on the slide here, right? But I say quite often, when there's an organizational sort of culture to not adapt to business change and not adapt to technology change, you are asking for long-term trouble for your business. And I would say the same for your own personal career as well, right? So just don't you be one of those individuals or corporations or organizations that thinks I'm going to cut costs or whatever it is, right? And I'm not going to look at this now. I don't care about having businesses, applications that self-heal and respond dynamically to change and allow me to scale and push updates without taking applications down. That's technology. I don't care about that. Please don't let that be you, right? Because if it is, you are going to struggle as technology becomes more and more a fundamental part of your business. Make sure that you're not one of the ugly, okay? So just the things that we mentioned there, right? Kubernetes, cloud native, microservices, containers, all these buzzwords that we've got courses that explain. They give you flexibility, automatic scaling, self-healing. They let you deploy updates and improvements and bug fixes super fast so that your environment, your customer data, all that stuff is exposed to bad people for shorter windows and things. And of course, you're future-proofing your business and your own personal career. And on that, let me have a look at the time. Let me see if I did this right earlier and we get different text. Right. Okay. So we did a rolling update of an application earlier on to a different version, and it's gone from Pluralsight or whatever it was, I should have checked that, to Kubernetes State of the Union. And let me just remind you, we did that without interruption to service by changing one line in a file here. I know, like, if this is new to you, this file is going to be like, yeah, it looks disgustingly complex, but it's not. It's much easier than long lists of imperative commands that would have had to happen behind the scenes to make that all work. I mean, that would have been hideously complex scripts back in the day, whereas now we've got a relatively simple file. We give it to Kubernetes and say, look, Kubernetes, I want, what have we got? 10 replicas here of this version of my application now. Go and do the hard work of rolling off the old version onto the new one. Boom, done. Thanks, Kubernetes. And on that, I am going to load up Slack, take a drink, and hack at some of these questions. Before I say that, though, right, for sure, like, I can vouch for my own courses on Pluralsight because I have people feed back to me on them all the time, to be able to say that there's a good investment of your time, because I know your time is important. I don't want you to waste your time. But even outside of me, the content we have on Pluralsight. Right. Questions. I'm going to have to cherry pick some here. Okay. So thank you for all of the questions. If I don't get to yours, sorry. Can you run cubes in Kubernetes? If that was your question, I don't understand it. So if you're still on the call, feel free to say, oh, that was my question, provide some more context, and I'll try and take a look at it. What is your view on Kubernetes and containers versus serverless technologies, e.g. Azure Functions and AWS Lambda? So I'll broaden the question a little bit to what's my opinion on Kubernetes and containers versus mainframes, versus physical servers, versus VMs, versus serverless functions as a service type stuff as well. Yeah. And I will say that they all have a part to play, or it wouldn't be uncommon for multiple of those to have a part to play in any modern business application, right? So I'm not saying that containers and Kubernetes is right for every application service in your business. I do think going forward, it is becoming increasingly more the case where Kubernetes and containers are the right thing. But serverless, like functions as a service, of course, likewise is increasing in popularity as well. I do think, and I don't mean any disrespect here, and this is an opinion, I'm not calling anybody's project or anything ugly here. I've already called people ugly. I do think we are seeing a decline in the use of virtual machines and physical servers and things, of course, in favor of containers, Kubernetes, and in favor of serverless as well. So yeah, that's my opinion on that. If we are already using containers on AWS ECS, what advantages do we get moving from ECS, Elastic Container Service, to EKS, loads of acronyms here, Elastic Kubernetes Service? So one of them is Amazon's, let's just call it proprietary container service platform, and the other one is based on open source Kubernetes. The answer is in my answer there, really. One of them is proprietary and one is open source. I would these days always bet on the open source, but as well as that, to layer on top of it, anywhere that you have Kubernetes, as long as you're not consuming lots of other proprietary services on AWS or Azure or whatever your cloud platform is, if you are running on Kubernetes on that cloud and you have Kubernetes in your on-prem data center or on a different cloud, it's actually pretty easy to migrate your workloads to those different environments. If you are on ECS, you're a lot more locked in there. So for me, the strategic choice should always be anything that's the more open of the two. And Kubernetes is becoming that sort of de facto operating system for the cloud, so that no matter where you run Kubernetes, whatever cloud you're on, even your on-prem data center, if you've got Kubernetes there, you can easily migrate and run your Kubernetes applications on any of them. Doesn't care what the underlying infrastructure is. Are you seeing more COTS, commodity off the shelf, I guess, being delivered in container form. Oh, yes. Okay. I'm seeing more, but from my viewpoint, it's still a minority. Yes. So I think like prepackaged applications and things like that you just pick off the shelf have been somewhat slow to move to containers due to like learning curve and complexity and waiting for those products to mature. But I think now that companies like IBM and HPE and Microsoft, and all of them are getting on board here. All of their different partners and VARs and people like that will start to offer more of their products as containers. That's my personal opinion going forward. Docker Kubernetes will work on Apple ARM. Any insights? So I've not played around on ARM, but I know that for sure, like there's loads of Docker container images and stuff that will run on ARM architectures now. And I believe it's the same for Kubernetes now as well. But yeah, I mean, Docker did a lot of work with the folks at ARM to get the architecture supported for both the container runtime and of course the images. So now a lot of these images stored on Docker Hub in different places, a little bit technical maybe, but have image manifests that will, so you have the same image for Windows, Linux on x86, Linux on ARM. It's all dead simple now. So yeah. Are there any major differences, things to be aware of in how AWS, Azure, Google have implemented Kubernetes as a service? It's a really good question, actually. I can't really call anything out in particular. Some of like the way that like things integrate with like authentication services, Active Directory and things like that can be different between the platforms. But I think thus far, and we as a community need to keep the pressure on the different vendors here, right? But I think thus far, they've been okay at trying to implement their Kubernetes hosted platforms as sort of upstream or vanilla as possible. But of course, it's in their interests to lock you into their platforms, unfortunately. It makes business sense, I get that. So you do have to do your own homework there. And between the different service offerings, different hosted Kubernetes platforms that are out there. You had mentioned namespaces are not security boundaries, but instead create separate clusters. Yes. If the requirement is to deploy microservices in Kubernetes, how can you ensure the secure deployment of the containers in Kubernetes? And what are some of the security capabilities Kubernetes offers? Wish I hadn't read that question because the answer is long and deep. Kubernetes has a bunch of different technologies that I don't have time to go into here, but that will, like, as examples, right? And Docker too at the sort of more lower level runtime level, but there are technologies that will prevent containers from running as root on a Kubernetes cluster. You can filter what syscalls your containers can make to the kernel on the host below. You can drop capabilities for the super user account if you do have to run as root user. There's SE Linux policies, app armor policies, loads and loads of things. But I will say to run like extremely secure containers does require quite a bit of know-how, quite a bit of effort, and quite a bit of testing. Certainly to get it to the same sort of security workload isolation level that you would expect from a virtual machine, you have to put more effort in to get there with containers. I really can't take more than that at the moment because just because of time, really, and there's quite a few questions, but super good question. Can you explain more about the relationship between Helm charts and Kubernetes? Is it really just a package manager for Kubernetes? Again, a little bit sort of off topic, but if you want to be able to deploy applications without having, and this is a super simple YAML, right? Some of them are very long. Excuse me. If you want to be able to deploy, excuse me, hang on. Sorry about that. Almost a pre-packaged application like an implementation of MySQL persistent database or something like that, without having to build it yourself and have all that sort of MySQL domain specific knowledge, then a Helm chart, which is just like an installer for that application can abstract a lot of this complexity from you. However, underneath, Helm is still relying on all of this YAML. So I always think it's good that you understand the fundamentals of this before using something like Helm. But by all means, yes, Helm it's kind of the next step in your maturity in working with Kubernetes. Hope that helps. Where are we? Do I have any experience with VMware VIC? I do not. I'm sorry about that. I do try and shy away as well from making product recommendations, just because it quite often comes down to the particulars of your environment, and I don't know your environment. You're the expert there. Might seem like I'm kind of deflecting that question. Well, I don't have experience there. I'll be honest about that. But I try and shy away from those questions usually anyway. What is your stance on Kubernetes management platforms in multi-cloud environment? Proprietary Anthos OpenShift versus vendor agnostic Rancher, Platform 9, things like that. Again, it's a little bit of a recommendation. I think they're all, they're all getting super powerful now and pretty feature rich. The question is like, what is my stance on the proprietary like Anthos and OpenShift versus vendor agnostic Rancher and Platform 9? Just at like quite a fundamental level, it's a personal thing here. I prefer things that are more vendor agnostic, but don't get me wrong. Like, of course, Anthos at the moment, which if you don't know is like Google's offering. Anthos now supports AWS, so Kubernetes on AWS, and I'm not sure if it supports Azure yet. If it doesn't, I know they've talked about it, it's roadmapped. So even some of those like Anthos are becoming, and it's in the interest of Google for this to happen, right? Becoming more cloud agnostic, even if the technology behind the scenes is a little bit more closed. That was a bit waffle, wasn't it? I hope that helped. Can you provide a use case example of how Kubernetes is changing the tech world? Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, not as a particular use case, but it's not hard to find them, right? Like, well, startups now, the ones that engage with me, and there might be a reason for this, right? But the startups that engage with me are all container first and cloud first these days. So they are deploying their applications and using Kubernetes to orchestrate them from day one. And it is so much cheaper and easier for them. And it gives them so much more flexibility and power than the older models of having to buy and rack servers in like a closet, or even having to deploy cloud instances, which were more expensive. So at like the entry-level startup, it's fundamentally changed the world. Little bit slower in larger enterprises, but most large enterprises that I talk to these days, in fact, I can't remember the last time I talked to somebody from a large enterprise where they didn't already have some container and Kubernetes going on. And I'm talking more than just kicking the tires with like a skunkworks project. Most of them are deploying, not a lot all the time, but are deploying applications to containers and Kubernetes and have a strategy to deploy more going forward. It very much, like I said before, feels like the world in 10 years' time will be as different as it was 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago when VMware was a little bit new. It's like totally different now to back then. And it will be even more different in 10 years. A little bit of a sort of fluffy answer that, but it for sure is not hard to find examples of it changing the tech world. I mean, just look, I mean, I don't know if this is a great example, but Microsoft, like back in the day, it was all selling Windows and Office licenses and things like that. Whereas now a major business unit within Microsoft is obviously the Azure cloud business, and strategic for Azure cloud is containers and Kubernetes and serverless as well. So Microsoft, like one of the biggest tech companies in the world, is almost, these are my words, right, but a container first company now in a service offering. I mean, Red Hat made strategic acquisitions around the container space. CoreOS, they bought other container-related companies, and then as a result, Red Hat was acquired by IBM because IBM, big old blue, mainframes and all that kind of jazz, are going with, again, my words, but almost a container and Kubernetes first strategy. So two of the biggest and longest running tech companies in the world have pivoted large portions of their business to be container and Kubernetes focused. So the writing is on the wall. Some customers prefer OpenShift and Kubernetes. And what are the key differences between both? I don't really want to get onto OpenShift massively. It's a great solution, don't get me wrong. I respect and admire what the guys at Red Hat and now IBM did and are doing, and trying to do what Red Hat did with Linux when it was super complicated. And then we came along with Red Hat and CentOS Linux and things like that. Much easier for people, wrapping it in a support contract and stuff like that big enterprises like and need. OpenShift in many ways is doing the same for vanilla upstream Kubernetes. I'll leave that one at that. I'm trying to pass the Google Cloud Associate Cloud Engineer exam. I didn't get through it successfully the first time. Sorry to hear that. Don't be disheartened though. What Kubernetes lab resources can you suggest? So check out my courses on Pluralsight, of course. Ping me on Twitter or take a look at my website. I would say msb.com is a great place for hands-on. So M for Mike, S for Sugar, B for Bravo, msb.com, short for Magic Sandbox. Hands-on real-world clusters with examples. You can't beat hands-on. But by all means, reach out to me online and we can have a conversation about that. What do you recommend to deploy Kubernetes in a high availability environment? We're coming towards the end of the hour now. So if you want the easy option and you are able to deploy to the public clouds, I do think the hosted Kubernetes offerings from most of the public cloud service providers are very, very good. That's an easy on-ramp to highly available, high-performance Kubernetes. If you're deploying yourself, like to somewhere like on-prem or even to your own private cloud, excuse me, some of the tooling around the project, like KubeADM, and I'm having a brain freeze right now, but the one that's specific for AWS, are much better now than they were, let's say, a couple of years ago at making it easy to deploy highly available Kubernetes clusters. So getting a bit technical where like the masters or the control plane is configured with multiple instances for high availability. So the cloud platforms provide the easiest sort of turnkey solution. Rancher Kubernetes Engine and some of the other tools allow you to kind of do it a bit more DIY yourself. But that sort of stuff is one of the areas where it's getting easier almost by the day. Okay. Last question. Okay. My webcam looks great. What am I using? It's a Logitech Brio 4K Stream Edition or something like that, I think. Ping me afterwards. I can tell you what that is. It's a Logitech one that's kind of an oval shape like that. Brio or something, 4K. But it is good. But I've got like studio lighting and stuff going on as well, so that might help. But yeah, I think probably on that note, I don't know if Daniel wants to come back in from Pluralsight or anything like that. But from my side, reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, anywhere like that. Get across to my website. I do a weekly newsletter. Search me on Pluralsight. Search the other guys on Pluralsight. Search Kubernetes, Docker. I see Daniel's coming on, but I say this all the time, right? We live in a golden age of technology where it's easier than ever to learn and get your hands on. And like Pluralsight as a platform, I'm going to be a shill here because I truly do believe in it, is at the forefront of this technology golden age. It's never been easier to learn Kubernetes or containers or even serverless. It's never been easier than it is now. So kudos to Pluralsight for that. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Daniel. and have a drink.
Great. Thank you so much, Nigel. I was doing my best to moderate everything that was coming through, but there were so many more questions. And so I just want to thank everyone for participating. And like Nigel said, I know personally, I've seen him just interacting with the community, and yeah, he's really awesome. So please hit him up on Twitter if you have any other questions. I know we weren't able to get to every single one that came through, but thanks again for joining us. If you're joining us on Zoom, you will receive an email in the next day or two with a link to watch the recorded version of this presentation, share it with a colleague, that sort of thing. If you're watching on another platform, then right as we're finishing up, you can, kind of stay there, and the on-demand version will be right there ready for you. But with that, I just want to thank everyone again for joining. And Nigel, I want to give you one opportunity. I think you already kind of shared a great takeaway. Is there anything else you want to leave with the audience today?
Yeah, I would just say that as individuals and as organizations or teams within your organization, don't be afraid to embrace change. And there is a lot of change that comes with containers and Kubernetes. And it can be frightening at first, but like I said, we're in this golden age, right? We have more resources to learn than ever before. And although like that initial step of deploying your first container or something, or of that initial mindset change of like, yeah, this is a different way of doing it. Once you're over that initial hurdle, most people fall in love with it and think, yeah, I really like this. So expect it to be difficult at first. It is for all of us. It was for me, right? Of course. Just don't be put off by that. And if after you've taken your first steps and you find it a bit hard, I'm on Twitter far too much, right? And reach out to me. And I prefer, you don't have to, but I prefer people to reach out to me in public. But if you're embarrassed to ask something in public, by all means, direct message me. But just if you do it in public, it gets, if I can't answer the question, somebody else might be able to, right? So yeah, don't be afraid and just embrace this change. It's so cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for everyone who joined us. Thanks again, Nigel, and everyone have a great rest of their day.